Welcome back to Whispers in the Dark. This is the story Hester might have told if she had opened the darkest rooms of memory and given them no mercy. It is the story of Miss Rosamond, the child she loved more than life, and the old northern house where winter itself seemed alive. It is the story of Miss Grace Funival, who had grown old but not innocent, of Miss Mutta, who was wronged unto death, and of the old lord whose curse kept playing through the organ long after his flesh had rotted in the ground. Listen to it as though you are hearing it by firelight in the depth of winter, with the wind searching every crack in the walls. Listen to it as if your own life depends on not opening the door. I was never one for foolish fancies when I was young. I had grown up among the fells and knew what loneliness was and what winter could do to sheep on the hills or to poor travelers caught in drifts before dawn. I knew the sound of wind in the chimney and sleet on the shutter and foxes crying in the dark. None of those things ever turned me cold. They belonged to God's world and could be named. But there are sounds that come from no weather, faces that belong to no living child, and footsteps that no human foot could make. Those things I learned later. When I first entered service, I was but a village girl, proud to be thought steady, clever with my needle, and fit to tend a little one. I came into the household of a lady who was gentle-born and kind-hearted, though sorrow hung over her like mist over water. She had married beneath the pride of her husband's noble kin, so people said, but if there was any shame in that, it did not show itself in her face. She looked at her child with such tenderness that one would have thought all rank and all old blood were nothing before it. That child was Miss Rosamond. Even now, after all the years that have gone over me, I can see her as she was. Fair curls that caught the light like pale gold thread, eyes wide and clear and soft as if wonder had made a home in them. A little mouth made for smiling, though sorrow came for her too soon. She was one of those children before whom hard faces change. Even stern men would glance twice at her. Women softened. Servants laughed more easily when she came pattering into a room. She seemed born to bring warmth where there was none. But happiness never stays long in this world without some old evil sniffing after it. Her mother died first. I remember the black clothes, the muffled voices, the stillness in the rooms, the way Miss Rosamond reached for arms that would never lift her again. Then her father went too, and she was left an orphan and a ward. Great people made decisions over her head as though she were a jewel to be locked in a cabinet. It was settled that she should be taken to the old manor house of the Funivals in Northumberland, to love under the charge of Miss Grace Funival, her father's aged kinswoman. I was not yet 18, and terrified to leave all that I knew, but there was never a thought of leaving Miss Rosamond. I would sooner have walked barefoot across the fell in frost than let her go among strangers without me. So I went. Mr. Henry, my lord's gentleman, rode with us to see us delivered there, and then he meant to leave us and join his master elsewhere before evening. That did not please me. There was cruelty in such haste. In setting a child down in a house she had never seen and turning from her hand before it had even closed upon yours. But a servant girl's thoughts were worth nothing. We drove there on a September day that felt already touched by winter. At the last town where we changed horses, there was smoke everywhere from pits and collieries, and the sky had the color of soot-stained wool. Miss Rosamond had fallen asleep, warm and trusting, her cheek against the cushions. But Mr. Henry told me sharply to wake her, for she must see the park and the house as we entered. I did not want to. Children should meet a new home gently. Still, I obeyed him. I wish now that I had let her sleep. She woke with heavy eyes and put her small hand in mine as the carriage rolled through the gates. The park was not like the green, trimmed lands of cheerful houses. It was vast and wild, full of rock, black water, thorn trees bent with age, and ancient oaks stripped pale in places, as though lightning had licked them clean. The road wound through a silence so deep that the sound of wheels seemed unwelcome there. Even the air felt old, as if no fresh wind had passed over that ground in 100 years. Then I saw the manor house. It rose long and gray against the bare fells, with many windows and projecting wings, grander than I had imagined, and far more desolate. No vine softened it. No cheerful smoke made it homelike. It seemed less a dwelling than a stone memory of power, the sort of place where generations had commanded, hated, married, betrayed, and died, until the very walls had learned to keep secrets better than priests. I had the strangest feeling that the house was looking at us before we looked at it, entered through the great front, and came into a hall so wide and high that I felt at once both foolish and insignificant, like a child who had strayed into a church built for giants. A chandelier of bronze hung from above. At one end, there was a fireplace so enormous that I thought a whole cottage could have sat within it. At the other stood the organ built into the wall, large, dark, and solemn, its pipes rising like ranks of dead men, frozen in prayer. I did not know then that it was broken within. I only knew I disliked it at once. An old servant led us through passages and rooms to the west drawing room, where Miss Grace Funival sat. She was nearly 80, thin as a winter branch, upright still, and lined all over with the fine wrinkles of a face that had once been proud and beautiful, and had since been dried by time rather than softened by it. Her eyes were sharp and watchful. Because she was very deaf, she used a trumpet, and depended much on the woman beside her, her maid and companion, Mrs. Stark. Mrs. Stark was an old woman too, but of another sort. Miss Grace looked worn by regret. Mrs. Stark looked carved from cold stone. There was no softness in her face, no impression that she had ever wept for anyone. If Miss Grace had once had a soul capable of love and terror, Mrs. Stark seemed to have made a religion of hardness. Mr. Henry delivered some message from my lord and left almost at once, taking no notice of the child's outstretched hand. I never forgave him for that. There we were then, Miss Rosamond and I, two lonely creatures in a house too large for comfort and too silent for peace. We were taken up at last to the old nursery above the kitchens, and that room was the first mercy the house showed us. There was a cheerful fire burning, a kettle singing on the hob, and tea laid ready. Old James, the footman, and Dorothy, his wife, welcomed us kindly. Dorothy especially, being from Westmoreland like me, soon became my comfort in the place. There was another servant too, Agnes, young and impressionable, with eyes that widened at every sudden sound. Between them, they made a sort of human island against the coldness of the rest of the house. For a little while, I could almost believe we might love there quietly. Miss Rosamond took to roaming wherever she was allowed, and because she was lovely and merry, even Miss Grace seemed to thaw in her presence. The child made adventures out of corridors and galleries, out of old jars and faded screens and gloomy rooms full of portraits. She laughed in corners where the dust had not been stirred in years. She darted like a sunbeam into places that had not seen true joy in generations. I followed always, watching her, calling to her, catching her when she ran too near some cracked stair or dark door. There was one part of the house we did not enter, the east wing. It was shut up and never opened. No one spoke of it more than necessary. The locked doors stood there in the hall with a strange weight to them, as if pressure from the other side rested always against the wood. I would sometimes pass them quickly without knowing why. Among the most curious things in the house were the pictures. Nearly every chamber in the western and northern portions seemed to hold solemn ancestors stung down with dead eyes that had once judged servants, daughters, tenants, and lovers. Their painted faces were proud, hard, thin-lipped, but none struck me so much as the portrait of Miss Grace when she was young. Dorothy showed it to us in the old state drawing room. Miss Rosamond was hiding among the furniture in play, and Dorothy, after looking behind her and lowering her voice, pointed it out. The young lady in blue satin who looked back from that frame was so beautiful that I could scarcely believe she and old Miss Grace were the same creature. Yet the pride in the raised brows, the contempt in the mouth, and the cold fire in the eyes were all still there, only fresher, brighter, and more terrible for being joined to beauty. It was a face made to be adored and feared. Then Dorothy, after hesitation, showed me another picture that had been turned to the wall and hidden from common sight. This was Miss Maud, the elder sister. To say she was more beautiful still sounds impossible, but it was true. There was more warmth in her look, more wildness perhaps, more life. Yet there was pride there too. The Furnivals had it in the bone. I could not stop staring. It seemed to me that if those two women had ever loved anything, they would have loved it fiercely enough to destroy it. Dorothy hurried the picture back and would say no more. But I saw fear in her, and from that hour my mind began to work uneasily. As autumn deepened and evening came earlier, I began to hear the music. It started faintly. I would have put Miss Rosamond to bed and be sitting quietly by the small fire in the bedroom, the child breathing softly in sleep, when there would come from a great distance a low swelling sound, not random enough for wind, not thin enough for boards creaking. It was music, deep notes rising and falling, as though some unseen hands were drawing grief out of iron and wood. The organ in the hall. The first time I asked about it, James snapped that I was a fool and had heard no more than the wind among the trees. But Dorothy went pale, and Agnes made a sign against evil before pretending to busy herself. From then on, I kept my questions for the kitchen, for the shadows, for the moments when one of them might let something slip. Agnes was the first to tell me what the others would not. It came mostly in winter, she whispered, and before storms, and people said it was the old lord playing. The old lord who had long been dead. She knew little more, or claimed to know little more. Yet the terror in her face convinced me she believed every word. The next day, driven partly by bravery and partly by that miserable curiosity that has led many a soul into doom, I opened the organ in the hall while no one was there. Inside it was ruined, splintered, broken, dust thick on dead works that no human hand could have made sing. When I saw that in broad day, my skin crawled as if touched by something filthy and cold. I shut it at once and ran. After that, every sound it made seemed less like music and more like a voice forced through rotten timber. The nights grew worse. The notes would come fuller, sadder, stormier, filling the spaces of the house with a grandeur that was not beautiful but dreadful. Sometimes it seemed the music climbed the stairs. Sometimes it sank away as though descending into the earth beneath the hall. There were moments, lying awake in the darkness, when I could have sworn the organ was not being played in the present at all, but was simply sounding again from some old event that refused to finish. Then winter took the land. By late November, the cold became cruel. Frost silvered every pane and bit through cracks in the frames. The fells beyond the house turned bare and iron-colored under a low sky. The trees in the park looked like blackened bones. Wind came down from the heights with a long, desolate cry that never seemed entirely natural to me once the haunting had begun. It was too full of lament, too like breath dragged through dead lungs. Miss Rosamond still ran and laughed, though more of our play was indoors now, and that was perhaps why the house had more chance to find her. One afternoon not long before Christmas, we were in the great hall, amusing ourselves on the billiard table. Dusk had crept upon us so softly that I scarcely noticed it until the windows had turned gray, and the corners of the room seemed to gather shadow like old cloaks. Miss Rosamond was rolling an ivory ball and laughing to see it spin when suddenly she stopped, stood perfectly still, and cried out in a voice full of delight and pity together, "Oh, Hester, my little girl, my poor little girl out in the snow." I turned to the long, narrow windows and saw her. A child stood outside, smaller even than Miss Rosamond. She wore clothing too fine and thin for such weather, old-fashioned in cut and pale in color, and her hair hung damp against her face. Her little hands beat the pane in frantic appeal. Her mouth was open wide in sobbing cries, yet no sound came through the glass, Not the faintest tap, not one whimper. It was a silent agony. Miss Rosamond flew toward the door. She would have opened it in another breath. And then the organ burst out. Never had I heard such sound. It did not begin gradually, but came all at once in a violent peal that shook the hall and seemed to strike the inside of my bones. The notes roared through the air like a warning hurled by some immense invisible rage. I snatched up Miss Rosamond just as her hand neared the latch. She kicked and wept and screamed against me, calling me cruel, begging for the poor little girl. I ran with her to the kitchen so fast I thought my lungs would tear. Dorothy looked up, and one glimpse of my face told her enough. She ordered the doors bolted. Agnes nearly dropped the tray in her hands. Miss Rosamond sobbed herself half sick over the child she believed I had left to freeze. When at last she slept, I went back down and told Dorothy I would take my charge away somehow, right or wrong, for I had seen enough. It was then, cornered by fear and anger, that Dorothy told me the old story. The old lord, she said, had been a man eaten alive by pride. His daughters were Miss Maud and Miss Grace. Miss Maud was the elder, and by rights Miss Furnivall. But pride and beauty and envy lived like wolves in that household. Both sisters had loved the same man, a foreign musician, clever and handsome, with a manner that pleased them and a rank that did not. The old lord would never consent to such a match. Yet Miss Maud loved him, and he loved her. What passed between the sisters Dorothy could not fully say, but bitterness grew there. Miss Grace, younger, and not used to losing what she desired, hated Miss Maud for being more beloved, more beautiful, more fortunate. The old lord favored grandeur over mercy. Sin ripened within those walls like poison in a sealed cup. Miss Maud bore a child in secret. I remember the way Dorothy whispered that part, almost choking on the words, as though shame and pity still fought in her, even after so many years. The child was hidden as long as it could be. Mrs. Stark knew. Miss Grace knew. The old lord learned the truth at last on a fearful winter night after the new year had just begun. Then came the horror. He drove Miss Maud from the house in a storm, cursing her and the infant with language too dreadful to repeat. He forbade any servant, on pain of eternal damnation, to aid them with food or fire or shelter. Dorothy's face twisted when she told it. The old lord raged like a madman. Miss Maud defied him. There was a struggle. A blow fell. The child was struck on the right shoulder. By morning, shepherds found Miss Maud on the fell, crazed, smiling horribly, clutching the dead child in her arms beneath the holly trees. The mark on the little shoulder was plain, but Dorothy said the blow had not killed it. The frost had. The cold had. The child had frozen out there, while the great house kept its fires lit and its doors shut. I felt sick all through, sick in the body and sick in the soul. Yet worse remained. Miss Grace, Dorothy said, had stood by. She had neither helped nor forgiven. Whether from hatred, jealousy, or some devilish obedience to pride, she let her sister go to death. That was the sin which could not rest. The old lord died within the year and never touched the organ again while alive. Yet after death, when wind and storm came, he returned to his music. From that night on, I watched Miss Rosamond as if murder walked the passages seeking her. We bolted shutters before dark. We kept doors fastened. We prayed. Still, the child was not done with us. Miss Rosamond would sometimes turn her head sharply, as if hearing distant weeping. During her prayers, she would stop and say very piteously that her little girl was crying outside and must be let in, or she would die. It took all my strength to soothe her. Often she would point to places where I saw nothing and smile as if at a companion. That frightened me more than any open apparition, because it meant the thing was drawing closer to her. As for Miss Grace, I began to pity and fear her in equal measure. There was in her face a look so hopeless that it seemed less human than damned. She seldom spoke, yet when Miss Rosamond approached her, an expression would sometimes flicker there that looked almost like hunger. Not hunger for food, something worse, as though the innocent child's warmth hurt her, reminded her, accused her without words. Then came the night that ended all. It was just after the New Year. Snow had been falling for hours, thick and ceaseless, whitening every ledge and burying the paths until the world outside seemed erased. The organ had played more wildly than ever. I had put Miss Rosamond to bed, but would not leave her side. So uneasy was I, then the bell from the west drawing room rang 3 times, calling for me. I would not go without the child. I wrapped her in blankets and outer clothes and carried her down half asleep in my arms. Miss Grace and Mrs. Stark sat at their tapestry as usual, the lamplight falling on their old hands, the room warm, the curtains drawn tight. Yet, for all the coziness of the chamber, I felt cold enter me the instant I crossed the threshold. Mrs. Stark questioned why I had brought Miss Rosamond, but I saw from one glance at Miss Grace's face that she already knew or feared. There was a strained stillness in the room, the stillness one feels before thunder. I laid Miss Rosamond on the sofa. Miss Grace set me to unpicking some work on the tapestry where the silk had gone wrong. So I sat near them and sewed while the wind rose outside in long, savage gusts. Then Miss Grace stiffened. "I hear voices," she said. At once Miss Rosamond woke with a start and cried that her little girl was weeping bitterly. She tried to rise. I caught her. At first I heard nothing. Then, little by little, the sounds came. God preserve me. I hear them yet in dreams. There were screams in the hall. Screams of a woman, of a child, of rage. There was the old lord's voice cursing. There was a wild, defiant cry from a female throat. There was the sound of running feet, of a struggle, of a blow. And then a silence so sudden and deep it seemed to tear the world in two before moaning began again, low and dreadful, as if pain itself had found a tongue. The locked east doors in the hall started to groan. I could see from the drawing room that the great bronze chandelier out in the hall was alight, though no one had lit it, each branch burning with a pale, unnatural fire. The great hearth blazed too, yet gave no warmth. Light spread across the floor, not yellow, but bluish and thin, the color of winter moonshine on ice. It reached under the doors like spilled death. Miss Grace rose to her full height, white as linen pulled from a corpse. Mrs. Stark clutched her arm. Neither spoke. Miss Rosamond trembled violently in my hold. Then the east doors burst open with a crash so violent that the house itself seemed to cry out. A tall old man strode into the light, gray-haired and terrible, his eyes blazing with such fury that no living face could have borne it without going mad. His skin looked stretched and dry as old parchment over bone. The flesh of his cheeks seemed almost charred in places, as if hellfire had licked him and left him marked. His mouth opened in silent oaths that still somehow filled the air with blasphemy. One hand clutched a crutch. He drove before him a woman. She was young, proud, beautiful, and wild-eyed with despair. Her gown whipped about her as if in a storm none of us could feel. Snow crusted the hem. Her hair had come loose in dark ropes around her face. Her lips were cracked and bloodless. One hand was raised against him in fury and defiance. The other dragged at the little child who clung to her skirts, stumbling and crying. That child I would give every year remaining to me, not to remember the sight of it. Its face was blue with cold beneath the pallor of death. Its lips had gone dark. One cheek was scored raw as if by driven ice. The little fingers were swollen and split, the nails blackened, the skin along the knuckles burst and bleeding where it had beaten vainly against door or stone or frozen wood. Its eyes were too large and glassy, full of a pleading that no Christian soul could bear. On the right shoulder of its gown there spread a dark ruin where cloth had torn and flesh beneath had been crushed and bruised. I saw through the gap a mark black-purple and livid as rotten fruit, and around it the skin was broken in a crescent where something hard had struck with murderous force. Frost had burned the wound white at the edges. Even in ghostliness, it looked raw. Miss Grace cried out then, not in command, but in terror. "Father, Father, spare the child." And with that, another figure appeared. She did not come from any doorway. She grew slowly out of the cold blue light like an image forming in deep water. A lady in blue satin, beautiful beyond speech, her soft white hat drawn low over proud brows, her mouth curved in scorn. I knew her at once from the portrait. Young Miss Grace, young and radiant and merciless. The old Miss Grace beside us gave a sound then that I cannot name. Not a scream, not a sob. It was the tearing of a soul. The phantom old lord raised his crutch. Miss Maud tried to shield the child, but the spectral blow fell on the little right shoulder with a sickening force that made even the air seem to recoil. The child's mouth opened impossibly wide. Though no sound should have come from such a dead thing, this time I heard it. A thin, piercing shriek, unlike any earthly cry, so sharp and desperate that blood ran warm from my own nose at the sound. Miss Rosamond screamed too and buried her face against me. Then all moved at once. The old lord drove them onward toward the open outer dark. Miss Maud stumbled. Snow swirled about their feet, though the hall floor lay dry. Young Miss Grace stood aside, watching with triumph so cold and hateful that it seemed the very source of winter. Her eyes were fixed on her sister, and she smiled. God forgive me, but that smile was fouler than the wound on the child. It was the face of one who sees love destroyed and is satisfied. Old Miss Grace broke from Mrs. Stark and lurched into the hall, her hands outstretched. Not for her sister, not first, for the child. Take me, she cried, not the child. Oh, Father, I have sinned enough. Take me. The apparitions turned. For a moment, the hall was utterly still. Then the dead child raised its face toward her. I thought it would ask for mercy. I thought it would weep. Instead, it looked at old Miss Grace with such depth of accusation, such perfect knowledge of her guilt, that I saw the old woman's expression collapse into naked horror. That tiny frozen hand lifted and pointed straight at her. At the same instant, the bruised right shoulder seemed to burst open further, and from the torn place, there oozed something black and shining. Not blood as living flesh spills blood, but a dark, thick corruption that smoked in the cold light and ran down the child's sleeve in sluggish ropes. The smell that came with it was not of fresh injury, but of long sealed burial, old damp decay, sweet and foul together, like a crypt opened after years. Mrs. Stark fell on her knees, shrieking prayers and denials. She cried that she had done only what she was told. She cried that she had kept the secret. She cried that she had been loyal. The blue light brightened around her. The ghost child turned its face and looked at her too. Then both the living old women began to hear, or remember, more than we did. I know this because they clutched at their ears and moaned as if the sounds around them had become unbearable. Miss Grace babbled apologies to Maud. Mrs. Stark pleaded with the old lord, though whether with his ghost or with her memory of him, I cannot say. The hall filled with the organ, not from the instrument itself now, but from everywhere, from walls and floor and ceiling, from the marrow of the house, from the storm outside, from the depth of all that buried sin. The music was monstrous. It heaved and thundered like judgment. Beneath it, I heard, beneath all chance of mistake, the brittle snapping of frozen joints, the dragging of feet over crusted snow, the soft chattering of teeth in a child dying of cold, the low animal moans of a woman slipping into madness. The ghost of Miss Maud bent over her child and kissed its brow. When she lifted her head, there was frost thick on her lashes like white thorns. She looked not at the old lord, not at young Grace, but at old Miss Grace in the present. That look held no fury. Fury would have been mercy. It held sorrow beyond all sobbing and a condemnation so complete that words were not needed. Then the outer door of the hall, though barred and locked by human hands, swung open. Black night lay beyond, full of racing snow. Miss Rosamond fought suddenly with terrible strength to get down. "My little girl," she cried. I clutched her harder. Agnes and Dorothy came running from somewhere behind me, drawn by the screams, and James too, pale as wax. None dared cross fully into the hall. Old Miss Grace took one step toward the open door. Perhaps she meant to follow. Perhaps she was summoned. Her face had changed. All pride had gone from it. It had become that of a woman who at last sees what waits for her. The dead child extended its arms, not to be saved, to claim. Miss Grace gave a gasp, clutched at her breast, and fell. She did not die at once. That might have been kindness. She lay twisted on the stone, eyes fixed on the phantom company, as if they still stood before her. Her mouth worked. Foam touched her lips. One clawed hand scraped the floor so violently that the nails tore and left little bloody crescents behind. Mrs. Stark crawled to her, but Miss Grace recoiled from the touch and cried out, very clearly for one so near death, that there was ice on the child's skin and rot in the wound, and she could not bear its hands upon her. I heard that with my own ears. Dorothy heard it too. We all did. Then the child reached old Miss Grace. No one but I seemed to see precisely how. Perhaps terror sharpened my sight. Perhaps because I had guarded Miss Rosamond, I was forced to witness the end. The phantom child came close and laid its split, blackened fingers on Miss Grace's wrist. Frost spread at once over the skin. White crept along the veins under the flesh. The old woman convulsed. Her mouth opened in one long scream that went on, and on, even after no breath should have remained in her. By the time it ceased, a thin glazing of rime lay over her hand and arm. The lights in the hall went out. The fire vanished from the great hearth. The east doors stood closed again. Only the wind remained, howling down the chimney, and under the eaves like souls in torment. We carried Miss Rosamond upstairs half senseless with fright. I would not let anyone else touch her. She clung to me so hard that bruises came on my neck the next day. In the chamber above, while Dorothy tried to restore her, and James muttered prayers he had not spoken since boyhood, I listened for the organ. It had stopped. Miss Grace died before morning. Mrs. Stark lingered some weeks, but never recovered. She would stare at empty corners, whisper to unseen figures, and clutch at her own shoulder as if she felt there the echo of the child's wound. Once Agnes swore she heard Mrs. Stark begging someone in the dark not to leave her out in the snow. When at last she died too, there was such terror in her face that the woman who laid her out ran from the room and would not return alone. After Miss Grace's death, the house changed, though not to cheerfulness. It was as if a pressure had lifted from it. The air remained cold and the memories remained, but the worst was over. The organ no longer played. Miss Rosamond heard no more crying under the windows. The locked east wing was opened in time, though few cared to go there. Dust lay thick. Some old traces of disturbance remained in the passages. A cracked bit of wood near one threshold looked to me too much like it might once have been broken, by a crutch brought down in fury. I never touched it. We did not stay many months after. Arrangements were made. Lawyers came. Letters passed. At length, Miss Rosamond left that place for a kinder home, and I with her. Yet it was not so simple as shutting a door on a bad dream. The house had entered me. I carried its sounds for years. There are things I never told even then. On the morning after Miss Grace died, before dawn had fully come, I woke because the room was suddenly bitter cold. Colder than any winter chamber ought to be, with a fire banked in the grate. Miss Rosamond slept beside me, flushed and exhausted. At the foot of the bed stood the child, not crying, not pleading, only standing. The shoulder was hidden now beneath its little gown. The hands hung quiet. Its face no longer seemed twisted with pain, but with a grief so old it had passed beyond tears. It looked at Miss Rosamond first, and in that look there was something almost tender, as though two children had known each other across the barrier of life and death. Then it looked at me. Slowly it raised one hand and pointed not to the door, not to the window, but upward. I followed with my eyes. There was nothing on the ceiling but shadow. When I looked back, it had gone. Years later, I thought I understood. The dead child had never wanted warmth alone. It had wanted witness. It had wanted the truth brought into the light. It had wanted the guilty to remember. Yet there are darker possibilities. Sometimes I think it was warning me that the sins of one generation rise into the next unless they are named. Sometimes I think it was reminding me that even innocence can become a haunting when it dies by cruelty. And sometimes, in my worst hours, I wonder whether no dead child who has known such cold can ever truly be comforted. Miss Rosamond grew up gracious and lovely. She was not marked outwardly by what she had seen, though certain winter sounds would make her quiet. And she never liked great empty halls or music played on an organ after dusk. When she had children of her own, they climbed onto my knee and begged for stories, and often I would tell them harmless ones. But when storms came down from the north and the fire burned low, they would ask for the terrible tale, and I would feel again the cold of that house and the weight of that sleeping child in my arms. Do not think, because I have spoken so much of ghosts, that the worst evil belonged to the dead. No, the dead replay what has been done. The living do it first. The old lord with his pride was horror enough while breath remained in him. Young Grace with her envy and hard heart was more terrible than any apparition. Mrs. Stark with her obedience to wickedness was foul in a quieter way. The freezing child in the snow was the consequence, not the origin. That is why the haunting endured. Stone remembers violence. Wood remembers curses. Music remembers hands that once drew cruelty into sound. And where innocence dies abandoned, the world itself keeps account. Even now, when wind rattles at a casement, and there comes some faint, irregular sound from without, my blood turns cold. I am old, and I know the difference between weather and pleading. There are nights when I would swear I hear very small fingers tapping in patience, as if they have had long practice at waiting. There are moments when drifting snow against a pane takes on the shape of a little face, and I must close my eyes until reason returns. There are dreams in which I am once more in the hall, blue light everywhere, the old lord striding forward, Miss Maud wild and despairing, and the child turning to me with that frozen wound in its shoulder. In those dreams, I always fail. I never reach the door in time. I never snatch it from the storm. I wake with my hands clenched and the smell of cold stone in my nostrils. Perhaps that is why I tell it still. Perhaps stories are all the living can offer the dead when rescue comes too late. So if you have sat with me to the end of this night's tale, remember the child in the snow. Remember Miss Maud driven out. Remember that no rank, no blood, no grand name can cover over a cruelty that heaven has seen. If ever you stand warm while another shivers outside, think of the Furnival house and what became of those who shut their doors. If ever pride asks you to look away from suffering, remember the blue satin lady smiling while her sister lost all. And if some winter night you hear music in an empty hall from an instrument no living hand can play, then do not stay to listen for long. Bolt your doors before dark. Keep the fire high. Speak kindly to any child who weeps. And if something taps at the window with no sound at all, if you glimpse a little figure with frost in its hair and a torn shoulder dark against a pale gown, then pray for it. Pray for yourself as well, because there are griefs that wander. There are houses that hunger. And there are old stories that are not stories only, but warnings left behind by the dead. Thank you for staying with me through this darkness. Please like the video and subscribe for more. Good night.
Whispers of a love so true, painting dreams of me and you. And I'll hold you close in this moment so divine. Whispers of the night will forever intertwine.